their surface. And so he just finished saying, if you are from the third group, you're going to love what I'm going to tell you. And if you're from the first two groups, then don't read what I'm going to tell you because you're not going to like it and it's going to be bad for you.
Right.
Now he's up to...
I wasn't reading this.
Now I can begin page 9, the bottom of page 9. Now I can begin to discuss the matter with which I am really concerned.
Oh, okay. Great.
So that's section 3 over here in my version. And this is beginning to discuss what I also wanted to really discuss, why I thought this would be important to bring up. And it really starts to lay down a lot of fundamental ideas that are very important underpinnings to understanding a lot of these other things. And also, being that this kind of what instigated this year was a question about the nature of the soul of Bnei Noach. So I think that what he explains here and then some other things that Rambam explains are a very needed introduction and foundation to understanding these things and what it says in other sources about it. So I think it will help. All right.
I know for us, this is a foundation of a lot of things, even just getting past the Sheva Mitzvahs. Why are we reading the Sheva Mitzvahs? Are we doing them properly? Because there's people that do accept the Torah. Why are we accepting the Torah for the Sheva Mitzvahs and things like that? So, this is going an extra step further for a lot of us.
Sure.
It's highly important.
Right. And actually, I don't want to get into the halacha stuff yet, but the truth is that somebody that wants to accept the Sheva Mitzvahs or someone that wants to convert, either way, the main thing that you're supposed to teach them are these fundamental principles of Judaism. And the laws are really something that's secondary to, on the other hand, if there's a situation where you can impose to force society to keep the Sheva Mitzvahs, whether people want to or not, you should do that just to make it a just society. But that's, for somebody that's on the lowest level of spiritual maturity and, you just need to keep
side of things.
But that's not what this group is about. So this group is about people that are, actively pursuing learning this and not running away from it and just trying to get away with doing whatever they can get away with. So,
that's amazing that you say that, because I think a lot of us sense that, but we've never heard a rabbi I shouldn't say we've never. Rabbi Katz talks about it, but anybody besides Rabbi Katz, I should say. And that is compelling. A lot of us don't really need compelling. We've already been compelled by some whatever reason. And I forget the Hebrew word is lakaf or something like that. I forget something.
Yeah, lachayf to compel, right?
Yeah, and we don't really need that, and a lot of it's backside. For instance, evadim and things like that. I don't really see us being, in the end times when it comes to the goyim and the nations repenting. I don't know if we're probably not going to be in that category.
Right. Yeah. Well, like I said, there's a lot of these things in the halachos that are, for better or for worse, most of the things that are the fundamentals are not something like he says here. Most people are in the first two groups. So they're not really learning and understanding these things. Even people that are scholarly, Jewish scholars, most people aren't familiar with these things. And that really, for better or for worse, it really impairs one's ability to understand the Torah and the halachos in a way that you can really appreciate them and fully, properly apply them and stuff like that. On the other hand, this week's parsha is about the sin of the golden calf, and how I was just reading today how Moshe, after he came down, he moved his tent out of the camp and moved it outside. And, Moshe had tremendous self-sacrifice for the Erev Rav, which were, the converts that came up with the Jewish people. And he was mainly defending them, that they should be, to be kept part of the Jewish people. And so he actually moved his tent outside of the Jewish camp until God forgave them. And he said, I won't go in unless, till they can go back in. And, so, there's, you see this, this idea very strongly of how, what Moshe did, and how much, in general, one of the main things that Moshe did with the, giving the Torah was to to connect people that weren't, even if they didn't understand all this stuff, to connect them to godliness as much as possible. And so, I'm not, God forbid, in any way trying to, look down or say anything negative about people that don't know all this stuff. But for better or for worse, the reality is that most people don't learn these things, or don't learn them very well and understand them very well. And it's very hard to understand what the Torah is really talking about without, like he's going to say here, without understanding these things. And so if you really want to get it, you got to learn this stuff. So that's why I'm a big fan of learning the fundamentals.
Yeah, this is great. So for everybody listening, I marked with a green checkbox where we're starting, and whenever Rabbi Walters is ready, he can. Okay. I'll mute my mic, and I'll have to keep recording, but I'll mute my mic and let you have at it.
Okay, so let's go. Once again, I'm going to read it in, and I said it was the Hebrew original, which isn't completely correct. Originally Rambam wrote this in Arabic, and this is a translation into Hebrew, but it's still easier for me, and I find that it has more of those subtleties than the English translation. So, I don't know Arabic, so I'm going to read you from this. Okay, Gimel. Va'ata, now, I'm going to begin discussing what I originally intended to discuss, now that I've given these two general introductions about, one, understanding, like the metaphor of when you're trying to educate a child, that at first they don't have the maturity to appreciate the true intrinsic motive for wanting to learn and wanting to know truth and wanting to develop their abilities. And so therefore the teacher has to present things to them in ways that are tangible according to their level, in order to slowly educate them and bring them to that maturity. And the second thing is realizing that in the words of the Torah and the words of the sages, there is deeper ideas than what just a person would get just from reading it as a story, or very surface the reading. Okay, you should know, just like a blind person cannot understand colors. So it's impossible to really explain color to somebody that was born blind. And someone that was born deaf can't understand what it's like to hear. And someone that was born with some sort of impotence can't understand the sexual desires. So too, in general, our body doesn't relate to the pleasures of the soul, the experience of the soul. And so there's a certain type of learning which is experiential, and you can only know it by experiencing it directly. And that's what he's talking about here. And so here what he's calling the soul's pleasures is really godliness, that the soul has a pleasure in godly things, and that's something that makes sense to the soul. Here what he's talking about, the godly soul, it doesn't make sense to the body. So the animal soul that's which is called, in terminology is called the animal soul, that's enlivens the body, is focused just on the survival of the body, and everything is within that context of what is going to help me in defining me as my body. It's very egocentric, and it's focused on just the survival of my body. And so getting food, getting shelter, getting clothes, getting power, anything that will help me get those basic needs, being able to reproduce, those are all the basic needs of the body that make sense to the body. And but the needs of the soul are something that's higher that doesn't make sense in that context. And just like a fish, since it's always completely enveloped in water, can't comprehend the element of fire, because their whole being, their whole existence is completely subsumed, completely in an environment, in a context that's the opposite of that. So as long as a person is living their life and viewing the world through this type of physical, tangible, bodily perspective, they can't understand spiritual things, which here refers really to godliness. And so, these are two different perspectives that are completely different experiences. And as long as a person's viewing everything within the context and the framework of what makes sense from a bodily perspective, that's going to limit them. Similar to, like we were saying before, about the child that doesn't have the maturity to understand, the value of learning. So this is a similar type of thing. It doesn't exist in their world in the context of the body. So as long as we're looking at just the body's worldly perspective, there's nothing exists in our reality other than the body's pleasures. And what the senses of the body, the physical senses, can appreciate from food and drink and sexuality. And from this perspective, there's really nothing else that exists in the world. There's nothing else to life. And so there's nothing else that we can recognize and understand just like intuitively. So without really looking deeply into something, that's what it means, just like at a first glance, at a surface, view of the world and the body's desires, without really digging deeper, a person is not going to find any other experience to life. It requires great investigation and thought to really peel back these external layers and find something deeper. So, in Kabbalistic terminology, they would call this a klippa, a shell, this physical shell that's covering over the godly experiences that have to be peeled away. And in general, this is a certain mindset that locks a person in this perspective, and that's a mindset of egocentric mindset, and really being self-centered, and especially that comes along with when it comes along with a fixed mindset, especially where a person views themselves as being unable to really change, and their surroundings, they feel like they just have to, or they feel judged by their actions and their successes, and they feel like they just need to validate their being, and that kind of especially locks a person into just feeling like, well, I am what I am, and I just have to kind of try to validate that, and anything that goes wrong, I have to just find something to blame for it, because it obviously can't be for me, and it prevents a person from really growing or changing. That type of mindset. If anybody's familiar with it, it's a concept in psychology and stuff like that. Okay. And so being that we, as long as we're living in this physical world, this bodily physical world, we don't understand or appreciate anything other than these lowly temporal pleasures. On the other hand, every pleasure of the body is something that is a need that we fill, and then the body burns through it, because the body is essentially needy. And so from the perspective of the body, we always need to keep eating, we need to keep drinking, we need air, we need all these things, and then whatever benefit we get from those goes away, and then we need to refill the tank. And so it's a never-ending cycle of always trying to get more and more and more. And so those are really it's this the needs of the body, or the fact that the body is limited and is essentially needy, needs things from outside of it to constantly maintain its existence. And so that gives a certain perspective. And the things it enjoys is getting these external things that will keep it going. On the other hand, the pleasures of the soul are constant, because the soul doesn't need anything. The soul exists inherently. It has essential life from God, and therefore it doesn't need anything. And so everything that the soul enjoys is intrinsic. It enjoys not that there's something outside of itself that it needs to get to maintain its existence or to feed itself. It has the soul is like a star that has this unlimited energy and light that it wants to give and it wants to share. And it's this intrinsic power and force that's motivating it to want to go out and express, its abilities, to share the beauty that it has, to share its insights and share kindness with others. And that's the pleasure of the soul. And so what the soul enjoys are things that are constant and never cease. And these two types of pleasure, the pleasure of the body, the needy pleasures of fulfilling the body's needs, as opposed, which are extrinsic, versus the intrinsic motives of the soul to just express, to share beauty, to share wisdom, to share kindness, to be creative. Those are the kind of things that the soul enjoys. And those, they're completely different worlds. They're worlds apart. And each one doesn't have any experience or context for the other one. So the body doesn't appreciate the soul's pleasures, and the soul doesn't appreciate the body's pleasures. It's a completely different reality. אבל באמס שיש להם תענוג גדול מאוד במה שהם יודעים משיגים באמיתוס הבורא יתברך, ובזה הם בתענוג תמידי שאינו נפסק. And let's see. So he says it's not proper or fitting or appropriate for us who are people that students of the Torah, or even just the people that study godliness of the philosophers, to say that the angels, somebody that understands about the angels and what he calls the Kachavim and Galgalim, doesn't really refer to the stars and how do they translate it? Galgalim here is spheres. So those don't refer to the physical stars that we see. Those are made lower, but we'll get to what it means. But anyway, the spiritual entities in creation that God created. So to say that they don't have pleasure, somebody that understands about these things would recognize that that's not true, because they have great pleasure from the fact that they know and grasp that something of the truth of God. And here, when he speaks about angels and things like that, so they don't really have a soul and a consciousness the way that a person does, but it's the idea of when you say that something captures, let's say you say like a piece of music captures a certain feeling, or a work of art captures something, it expresses something of godliness. So anytime something becomes transparent to godliness and is expressing something of godliness, that's called this kind of spiritual pleasure. Okay, so they have this inner essential driving force, which is the fact that they are expressing this something of godliness, and they're in some way uniting with godliness. Ve'ein taina gufani etzlam, ve'ein masigun eisai. And these spiritual beings have no sort of bodily pleasure, and they don't even relate to it or understand it at all. Lefisha ein lehem chushim kamainu, because they don't have senses like us. She'asigu behem masha anu masigum eisai, for them to relate to and understand the kind of things that the worldly physical things that we relate to. וכמי כן אנחנו, כשיזדכה ממנו מי שיזדכה, ויעל עיסא מעלה, and so too with a person. When a person will refine himself and rise up to this type of level of spiritual maturity where they have at least an appreciation of God, an appreciation of this type of a pleasure, that they're not just focused on survival and they're not just focused on being needy, but they're focused on being a contributor and being a creator and being somebody that's giving to others and making the world a better place and helping other people, and just appreciate that type of the intrinsically motivated thing. And so too, the soul, once it leaves the body, so it rises up to a level similar to the angels, and it also at that point doesn't have any needs anymore, it doesn't have any physical bodily pleasures, and it doesn't have any desire for them anymore. But אלא כאין שירצה המלך שהוא גדול הממשלה שיספשט ממלכוסי ממשלתי ויחזור לשחק עם הנערים בקדר ברחוב העיר. For the soul to care about the bodily pleasures of this world would be like a great king who's thinking about developing his kingdom and spreading it out. He has this something that is of a much greater value for him to go and, let's say, just want to go play ball with the kids in the street. So, it's like he's thinking about things that are on a much greater scale, and I mean, he might want to go play with his kid or something, but it's like lowering himself. It's not something that he really desires. A little kid wants to just go and play ball, but a person that's appreciates these higher things, what he cares about is spreading his his kingship and this something of essential value throughout the world. That's what he cares about. Even though, for sure, when the king was a little kid, he would much rather go be playing with the kids outside than ruling his kingdom. And this was when he was immature. He was young and immature, and he didn't appreciate the difference between these two type of pleasures. And just like, a person in this world, a big part of our life is inescapably going to be taking care of our bodily needs. And that's something that makes sense to us because we're living in a physical world where we have those needs. But as far as our soul's concerned, it's really functioning on a higher plane. When a person will really study deeply, think deeply or into these two types of pleasures and these two types of drive, motivating forces in life. So a person will recognize the lowliness of the one and the greatness of the second. That's, it's important to take care of our bodily needs and so we can live and be healthy, but ultimately just to live so we can eat, and eat so we can live to eat isn't worth very much. It's not really, it doesn't have any meaning and purpose, and it's not accomplishing anything. But having what we need so that we can go out and do something meaningful and use our body in this world as a platform to express this higher type of godly pleasure of bringing wisdom into the world, bringing goodness into the world, bringing beauty into the world. So that's something worthwhile. Even while we're alive here in this world, this second type of pleasure is something that's really greater and more fulfilling and more worthwhile for a person. And we find even within the self-centered pleasures of the body, we see that the spiritual pleasures are much stronger than the physical pleasures. That we see a person will exert themselves to no end in order to get honor and to be like in a leadership position, like we see now with the elections. People will go spend so much time and money and effort, even though they don't need anything, right? A lot of these people, they're already well off. It's not like they're hoping to be elected so they can feed themselves. but they're willing to give up a lot of time and effort and money and things to have this honor and have this power. Even though this isn't something that's about food and drink, it's not just about the body's basic needs, but we see that there's a part of a person that desires something bigger, and even if it's not in a godly way, but that there's a part of a person's soul that desires these type of spiritual pleasures more than the physical. And we see also again an example that's not necessarily a good example, but it shows the point that a person would be willing to give up a lot of things in order to take revenge on somebody, on their enemy, even more than they would work to get their bodily, their bodily pleasures. And we see that a lot of people will forego a lot of things just because of societal pressure that they don't want. They'll be embarrassed in front of other people. So we see that a person cares about this, has this sense, gets the sense of shame and wanting to be viewed in a good light that will be more valuable to them than just doing whatever they want. And, that's, again, it's not ideal that a person should be motivated by what other people think, but, it could be a good thing if a person uses honor and societal pressure to keep out of trouble. You could do worse things. Or a person wants to have a good name and wants to be famous, and known for good things. So a lot of times people, like we see a lot of times, people become big philanthropists once they're millionaires and billionaires, and then they go give away most of their money to charity because they'd rather be known as, have a good name. And so, a person might do it for that type of motive, which is still kind of self-centered, or a person could really sincerely want to do it to help people. But right now he's speaking even within kind of the body's motivations, we see that these spiritual pleasures are stronger than the physical. If this is true, even within this physical bodily world, how much more so in the spiritual world, that the pleasures of the soul, the drive and the desires of the soul to accomplish something are much stronger and more powerful than these drive just for survival. And so connecting to this higher type of consciousness where the person connects to the godly soul, that's what's called the world to come. So the world to come is really not it's not about a certain time. It's not like now we're in this world and then there's a world to come. It's that it's once a person connects to this, which would be called, Rambam calls it the human soul in Hilchas Yesodei HaTorah in his law in Mishnah Torah when he speaks about these laws, and compared to the soul that just the part of us that motivates us just to fulfill our bodily needs and our survival needs, so that he calls the animal soul. And once a person has a drive to know God and know truth and spread goodness altruistically, and once a person begins to tap into that type of life and that type of pleasure is called the life of the world to come. And that's called the world to come because it's a second level of maturity that a person comes to after first at least having some time just being a little kid and just being very self-centered, and then developing the maturity to be able to appreciate that part of ourselves. And this state that's called the world to come is when the soul comes to know the Creator, blessed be He. Like the angels, or even in a way that's greater than the angels. Now, this pleasure is not something that can be divided into parts. It's once a person recognizes this type of drive, this type of pleasure, it's not like there's a bunch of separate things that the soul needs. It's just this inner yearning to know God, to know truth, and to express it to others. And you can't describe it to somebody that hasn't tasted it. And there's no way to really give a proper metaphor or analogy to explain it in the physical world, because it's coming from a completely different context than anything that's in our worldly experience, as long as those worldly experiences are just self-centered. Elok Maish Amar Hanavi, Olav Shalom, rather like the prophet says of blessed memory, Kishenifla Be'enav Gedulas HaTayvahu, when he recognized the greatness of this good, Umay Lasai, Amar, he said, Ma Rav Tuvcha Asher Tzafante Recha. So it says in Tehillim, in Psalms, how great is your abundant goodness that you have hidden away for those that fear you. So in other words, that those that fear God come to refine themselves and get to this level where they appreciate this inner type of motivation, this inner type of life, which is a much greater thing. But it's hidden. It's safanta. It's hidden away, and we have to uncover it. And so too, our sages say in the Talmud, Ha'olam haba, the world to come, ein b'ilei achila v'lei shesiya v'lei retzicha v'lei sicha v'lei sashmish elatzigim yeshun v'atrei seyem b'rashayim nen miziv hashchina. That the world to come is a state where there's no eating, there's no drinking, there's no bathing or anointing oneself with oils, and there's no sexual relations. Rather, the righteous sit and their crowns are on their heads, and they bask in the ray of the Shekhinah. And so this is a state which, the soul, this soul, like we'll see, is something that's eternal and it lives on after the body's gone. And even when a person is alive in this world, a person can have this level of experience in this world. What does it mean their crowns are on their heads? Hisharu hanefesh bikim hamuskola. It means that the soul exists just with its knowledge of God, which is like its crown. That's metaphorically speaking about its crown. And so this is the knowledge of God, is like the crown of the soul. And that's what they're enjoying. And since God and the knowledge of Him are one thing, like the great philosophers have said, which, to explain that whole, what that means is beyond the scope of this work. But it's a very important thing that once a person taps into this level of the soul, this is a godly soul, and once the part of you that knows God and is able to have this experience is actually a part of God, is actually one with God Himself. That is actually, and so ultimately this study is not about learning about something outside of us. It's about learning about God is about being able to uncover and expose the piece of God that's inside of each of us and experience that and bring that out. Yes.
Rabbi Walters, I got a question. Is this what's called the crown of Torah? The reason why I ask is because we've read somewhere in my studies with Rabbi Turin that a non-Jew can receive a crown of Torah. He can't receive the crown of kingship or the crown of priesthood, but he can receive a crown of Torah. I don't know. I just want to throw that out there.
It may be related to the crown of Torah. I would really say, without looking into it specifically, there's the idea of this crown is anytime something is connecting to godliness, that's called the crown in this kind of terminology and in Kabbalah. And so that crown is basically once you see how something is God's unity, once you uncover God's unity in something, then that is like the inner motive and the inner drive that's really the source behind that thing, and that's the crown of the thing. So here we're uncovering that within ourself, within our own soul. And so that's the crown of the soul. When a person sees the inner godliness in the Torah, so knowing God and seeing how the knowledge of God through the Torah is one with Him, that's the crown of Torah. And then seeing that in us, on finding the godliness spark inside of a person, that's this crown that sits on the souls of the soul, on the soul's head, so to speak. And
so are we talking about Keter?
Yeah, this would all be Keter, yeah. And
okay,
there's different crowns, and I think that this crown might actually be called the Keser Shem Tov, the crown of the good name. That's that's higher than even the crown of the Torah. But it's related because the crown of the Torah is seeing how God is one with the Torah. It says that there's three, there's God is one with the Torah and he's one with Yisrael. And so uncovering how God is one with the Torah is the crown of the Torah, and uncovering how the godly spark inside of yourself is how he's one with Yisrael. And we'll get to what that term means later. But just in short, it means somebody that's uncovered this level in themselves. Okay. So this is an important point, but he's not going to explain it at length here about how God and the Torah are one. And in the terminology of the Tanya, this is the idea that this a soul that's a piece of God, or the godly soul. But so when he says here the world to come, and he's speaking about revealing this godly soul, which comes from knowing God and uncovering that part of us which knows God and is motivated by that type of intrinsic motivation to know God and connect to Him, and that is called here Olam Haba, and in the terminology of Kabbalah and Chassidus that would be called the godly soul. V'amru, and they say v'nenem miziv hashchina, they enjoy the ray of the Shechina. Ratza leimer, which means to say she'oisen haneshamis misangais v'ma shemasiges v'yeides me'amitzah b'risparach, that the souls enjoy and delight in what they know from the knowing the truth of the Creator, blessed be He. Just like the holy Chayes angels, which are the highest of the angels in Rambam's categorization of the angels, he explains that there's 10 levels of angels, and those are the highest. And just like them and all the other levels of the angels have this inner, and here when he's saying pleasure, he means just in the broad sense of having this kind of intrinsic motivation, and that's driving their whole identity and everything. So just like the angels have that, so the godly soul has that too. Hine, and so based on what we've explained, now we can understand what we originally started talking about. What is the ultimate purpose of Torah and the mitzvahs? So people, have all sorts of explanations, which we didn't get into in detail, but there are all varying levels of extrinsic motivators that correspond to his analogy of the child that's it wants candy or wants money or wants clothes or wants honor, and that's what motivates them. But the truth is that the ultimate good and the ultimate purpose is l'hagia el ha'chevra ha'elyena hazais, to become part of this godly brotherhood, and to have this, this glory and be on this level where a person's able to appreciate godliness. The kiyam hanefesh k'maisha bi'arnu ad ein sof, and so this soul, this part of the soul that enlivens the body once the body's gone, that soul's gone. That's not needed anymore, and its whole existence only exists in context of the body. But this part of the soul that knows God and connects to truth and goodness intrinsically is something that is godly and it's eternal. Just like God is eternal because it's actually one with Him. Because God is the reason that it exists. It's really an extension of God. Because it has grasped Him. So by connecting and knowing God, it reveals this part of itself which is one with God and that is eternal. Kamaishi is bar philosophia rishaina, like explains in I think he's actually quoting is he quoting a certain book? What does it say here? In the English, this is the earlier philosophers. Okay. And this is the greatest good which cannot be compared to anything else. And there's no pleasure can be compared to it. How can you compare something that is this eternal constant thing to something that is That's just essentially a temporary conditional existence. The pleasure of our body is really just a conditional pleasure because the body needs it. So, if it's getting what it needs, then it has a pleasure attached to it, but it's not an inherent thing. And this is what it says in Devarim about the Torah mitzvahs. They're being given that it should be good for us and that we should lengthen our days. And what does it mean to lengthen the days? The day is only a certain length. So the simple meaning is to live long. But really what it means is the quality of life, that it's bringing this essential, infinite quality to our days and to our life. They have this godly meaning, godly purpose, which is something that's inherently good and is inherently long. In other words, it's really an infinite thing that's not just based on the needs of the body today at this time. And our tradition, the traditional explanation that we've received from Moshe about this verse is Laman yitavlach la'ilam shekulei taiv v'arachta yom la'ilam shekulei arach, that by keeping the mitzvahs, it's good for the person, that a person reaches this world, this higher type of living, which is all good, where a person sees this inner godliness in everything in themselves and in everything in the world, and sees that essential goodness to everything. And they see this world that's completely long. In other words, that they see the godly, infinite, eternal, godly reality underneath the veneer of changing physical realities that we see in the world. And so the purpose of the Torah mitzvahs is ultimately, this verse is as our tradition explains it, is saying that the real purpose of the Torah mitzvahs is to bring a person to this higher type of spiritual maturity where they appreciate godliness, which is something that's essentially good, and inherently eternal. And the worst thing, and the worst thing that can happen to a person, the greatest tragedy, is for a soul to be, a person's consciousness to be cut off from this soul and to be lost. So if a person's sense of self doesn't attach to the godly soul and remains attached just to the body, then when the body passes away, they don't have anything left. That's who they were. Their whole identity was the physical world and the physical body, and that's all gone. And if they never attached themselves, never experienced the pleasure of the soul, even though they have that spark inside of them, everything has that spark inside of them. But if a person never associated with that, then it's like they feel lost, that they're not. Even though the soul continues to live on, but you can't call it this person. It's not called the same person, because the person never had any, as far as they lived, and their whole consciousness doesn't have any connection to that godly life. And so
that makes me think of the penalty for transgressing the 7. Everything's decapitation, which seems very harsh, and but when you realize that it's removing the seichel, the intellect, from the body, which is the body's the lower 7 midot, the sephiros, that this is kind of talking about. The Rambam seems very Hasidic and deep in the things that he's explaining.
Yeah, I mean, he is. He's writing it. On the one hand, he's writing it in a style that's less Kabbalistic and more like a kind of a philosophy style. On the other hand, the advantage of the Rambam is that he writes in a little bit simpler terms, which is a double-edged sword. It's a little simpler to read and sometimes a little harder to appreciate what he's saying. But on the other hand, he comes the closest to coming out and just saying the things that, like he says, are harmful to somebody that's not going to appreciate them. And almost anywhere else in the earlier works of the sages, in the Talmud and the Midrashim, and in the later works of Kabbalah and Chassidus, they're usually going to couch any of these type of things in metaphoric terms so that it protects it from being misunderstood by people that won't get it. And so he's he says, like in his introduction to the Guide for the Perplexed, that even though you're not supposed to just say these things, but I see that it's been completely forgotten, and if I don't write it down somewhat openly, I'm going to die and it's going to be lost. And so I'm going to, write it anyway, and he does his best to warn his readers beforehand. And in the case of the Guide for Perplexed, I think he makes a special effort to bore you in the first chapters so that you won't continue reading unless you're really interested. I think he does, because like the first few chapters are just almost like a dictionary. He's just like translating terms.
Yeah. Well, that's how I view the seven mitzvahs and the Hive Mita. When I read that, I was, you freak out a bit as a, like, oh wow, everything's worthy of death, and it's not until you actually get past all that you start to realize what's.
Well, that's also when you understand like these different levels of maturity. If a person's on the lowest level where they really don't want to do, the lowest level of maturity a person can be on is where their whole existence is focused on the body, and that is also in a way which is they're not willing to change, they're not willing to conform and cooperate, and they're going to do things that are destructive to others and self-destructive, and they're not willing to change that unless you force them. That's like compared to like a wild animal. So if you go out, and to a lion pack or something like that, whichever one is stronger is going to win, and they'll fight to the death. And when, the younger cub gets strong enough to challenge the old one, it will take over the pack, and, it will be the leader. And so if you have people and nations that have that mentality, with that type of mindset where I'm just totally focused on my survival and that's all I care about. And I'm only willing to work with you if it's for my benefit tangibly. And I see that on a much more, small scale when I work with like delinquent teens, that, that somebody that's really just an obnoxious, abusive, delinquent kind of mindset, they get locked into that where they just view people as just for terms of tangible relationships. What can I get out of this person? They can't have a real sincere relationship with somebody. They can't be cooperative, and they can't really conform. They can kind of be manipulative, and they'll like maybe go along with something only as long as it's to their benefit. But as soon as it's not, then they'll lash out. And so the only way to correct that is, is to say, if you don't behave, I'm going to kill you. Or like you're not going to be allowed to come into the school or the class unless you're willing to accept that. And you have to lay down that first premise. Once you have that, and the person gets over that initial, shock, and it's kind of similar even with working with addictions or other types of things where a person gets in this kind of locked in a destructive loop like that, you have to break it out with this kind of harsh thing to crack that really tough shell. Right, because that's the whole reality.
Connected with the emotions.
So the only thing that can change the context of that type of reality is to say, well, if you're not going to be willing to talk to me about how you're going to compromise and how you're going to work within the rules, you're going to lose everything because you're going to die. Once you have that initial layer laid down, so then, okay, now we can talk and now we can work. And so that idea of that you're going to go out and force people to keep the 7 laws and everything is a penalty of death is when you're speaking about people that are on that level where they really don't want to, they need that. They don't want to accept it. They're, and if you look, I mean, there are people like that today. There's part of each of us that's like that, always that we have to keep in check and make sure, and it's good to have laws and police and, have that fear over our heads that ultimately I know that if I would really get out of line, I would get in trouble. That's an important thing to set that context for the body, because once you set that ultimatum, the purpose isn't to have to ever do it. And so that's why, so you find that, so that has to be, it has to be set really clear. But once that is made very clear and that ultimatum is in place, then it becomes reasonable to work together and to compromise and to cooperate. And so then you change the way you speak, and that's why it says that a court, a beis din in the times of the when the temple times, when they would have capital punishment in theory, if they executed even one person in 70 years, they were called a murderous beis din. Because the purpose of having the capital punishment is not to actually have to carry it out. So the ultimate goal is that you want to get the people to the state where they're able to sit down and learn. And that's why you see that I mean, this is kind of getting off topic, but it's just, something that people a lot of times look at and see it. And it seems horrible. These kind of things. It seems but the purpose of it is in that kind of thing, when you're going out to these pagan cultures and you have to force them, if they're not willing to accept, to come and learn and make peace, and you have to force them, then that's the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to go out and say, well, you have to accept to not do any of these things, or else we'll kill you, just to stop the kind of horrible atrocities that were going on in the world at that time. But the law is that if you're going to go out to war with anybody, any nation, even Amalek, you have to offer peace first. And somebody that wants to come and learn and change and, be civilized and learn the Torah and these things, that offer has to be on the table. And that's the ultimate goal. That's what we want. So, that's it's an important thing to realize that you always have in Torah law, when you have to look at the maturity level of the audience when you're speaking to somebody that's on that lowest level. So you have to be very black and white and very harsh in the way it's presented to break them out of that kind of really destructive mindset. Once a person's broken out of that, they go to the second stage of maturity where you're teaching them and working with them, and that's about slowly introducing more and more of the mitzvos, introducing good habits, creating a good healthy society, law and order, and teaching the Torah to develop a person's maturity and mind in that way. And
one thing that helped me was, and I can back this up just from what it says in Hasidus, but a person who studies the Torah on those reasons why, he kind of meditates on those, and he seeks the source of that harsh judgment. And then he finds the source of why those judgments are harsh, and that's when he gains wisdom, and he starts to develop a love for Hashem rather than just a fear.
Okay, so
probably it's
okay,
already been an hour.
Let's see let me just see where we're up to so we know where to stopping. Right, so the ultimate good is chaining this godly life of Haba, and the worst thing that can happen, the greatest tragedy, is for the soul to lose that connection. Let me just there's a stopping point here, and then that'll be a good place to stop, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay, sure. And this idea of the soul being cut off, the soul becomes lost. Like they said, he carries to kars nefesh. Like it says clearly in the verse that the soul will be cut off. He carries by haza. It's cut off from this world. The person, dies. Tikaris by haba, and they also then lose the world to come. That they don't have this connection to that level of their soul. And once again, that level of the soul is an eternal godly thing, but if the person's consciousness doesn't attach to that, then that's not called part of the person. It's considered something that's like outside of the person. On the other hand, it says about Eliyahu Hanavi, that Elijah, that my master's soul was bound up in the bond of life. So anyone whose life is completely caught up in the physical pleasures of the body, and a person despises truth and loves falseness and just is willing to, betray their soul and give up their any care for knowing truth and doing good just to serve their bodily needs, that type of mindset completely detaches a person from their sensitivity to that godly soul. And so that's called kares. V'yishar chaymer nichras, and they just remain a detached physical being. Uchvar be'er hanavi, and all of Hashem, and this is what the prophet of blessed memory says. Sha'elam haba einim musig b'chushim gufanim. They express this idea that the world to come, the godliness is something that can't be grasped through the physical senses. No eye has seen it except for you, God alone, and you've made it for those that await you. And this is what they said, that all of the prophecies describe the days of Mashiach, the benefits that will happen in the world that are tangible things that you can relate and explain to people. But the world to come is something that you can't explain to somebody that hasn't experienced it. So if you experience it, if you follow the Torah and the mitzvahs properly, a person can develop this, the sensitivity to experience that. But if somebody that doesn't have it, there's no way you can explain it to them. And so therefore the prophets don't try to explain those things because you really can't. Okay, so this is a good place to stop for now. We're almost at the end of this section here, and then he's going to start explaining the 13 principles. First he's going to answer. First he's going to tie up all these loose ends. Then he's going to go. Actually, the fifth section, he's going to explain the 13 principles. But yeah, so these ideas he's explaining here, and he's going to continue to develop, are really the foundation and of understanding what Judaism is really about, and how this all works, and what the Torah is about, the mitzvahs are about. And this idea is that every person has this part of them that's able to connect to God and this godly spark, and by the purpose of the Torah mitzvahs is to help a person get in touch with that and develop it, as we'll see.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is wonderful. This has been a very productive last 3 classes, and hope it'll continue.
Pleasure.
So thank you so much, Rabbi Walters. Let's see here. I'll end the recording here.